All right. All right. Okay. Man, there is never enough time in a day for everything, is there? I've already written 2 letters of recommendation for med school this morning, started my faculty annual review, and now I get to come teach this class, and I'm like, okay, is there time for coffee? That's what I really need to know. All right. So today, obviously, we're going to keep going on, talking about social theories of religion, right? So last time we covered, I guess, just Marx and Durkheim. I was expecting to cover more, but that's always the case with me. I never get through as much as I want. So we're going to keep rolling here. We got 10 slides out of 47 last time. So, let's keep rolling. We only got 4 more classes and then we should be done. Okay, so we basically, we looked at Durkheim to start with, right? And this functionalist kind of school of sociology, how it looks at religion, right? As this, essentially social phenomenon that emerges relatively naturally and is there, to give common values common values, some meaning, and to increase social solidarity. And we looked at our Marxist vision, right, which sees religion basically as a tool of the oppressors, of the overclass, whatever it happens to be, to justify their position and, give the promise. And again, I think Marx is looking explicitly a little bit too much through the lens of European Christianity, an afterlife that's wonderful and beautiful so that the underclass doesn't rebel. All right, so we ended off, we were talking a little bit about Weber, right? So we started talking about Weber, depending on how you classify him, right? Sometimes Weber gets classified in conflict theory. Sometimes he gets classified in symbolic interactionism. So often when we're talking about his views of religion, we put it in kind of interactionism because there's a particular stress in Weber's thoughts on religion about how religion can contribute to social change, right? Specifically through how specific concepts get interpreted. And his kind of masterwork on this is probably one of the books that Weber's best known for, actually, is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he essentially makes the argument that, Christianity, in a particular form, Calvinism, which had this weird kind of stress. Oh, I should have played the Protestant song for you to give you the kind of overview of what different Protestants believe. But John Calvin, right, basically after the Protestant Reformation, started by Martin Luther on October 31st, 1517, right, Halloween 1517, kicks off, a period of kind of, how to put this, breaking apart for European Christianity, right? And so you get first the split between the Catholics and the Lutherans, but then other Protestant groups kind of split off from there. And basically, you get just a real diversity of kind of views. And John Calvin, who's this French-Swiss kind of theologian, comes up with one of the more unique ones, and it gets adopted by a whole bunch of people. Amongst other things, right, what happens with this split from Catholicism is the way that Catholicism had envisioned people getting salvation, right, getting to go to heaven. In Catholicism, it was all through the church, specifically administered through what are called sacraments, right? And basically that is baptism, First Communion, or communion, reconciliation, the Eucharist, reconciliation, or confession, confirmation, marriage, ordination, marriage for people who get married, ordination for priests, and then last rites, right? These are the sacraments from which people would get, grace from God and get salvation. John Calvin basically does away with all of the sacraments. And so it leaves this sort of, and he has this kind of weird thinking that, okay, God had to know, because God is omniscient, right? So God knew who was going to heaven before time even began and who was going to hell. So there's a fixed number of places in heaven. And so basically, from the moment you're born, you're either, or even before, you're either damned or you're saved, and there's nothing you can really do about it, right? It's all predestined. It's sometimes referred to in theology, and I know you don't care, and it's way too deep into theology, as double predestination. But anyway, Calvin has this theory, and a whole bunch of people adopt the kind of Calvinist view. And these people, for Weber, end up having a sort of problem, right? It's like, how do you know that you are on that list of set number of people who get to go to heaven? And one of the ways that people sort of reassured themselves was by looking at whether they were doing well in life, right? So basically, if you were doing well in life, like you were prosperous, you could say that God had blessed you, and therefore you were probably on the guest list to get into heaven. So then what happens with these particular Protestants is they turn their, what Weber calls asceticism, right? Basically this sort of Christian principle that you should live simply, to great use for capitalism, right? So they continue to live simply. And what do they do with all of that excess wealth that they're generating, all the money they're saving? They reinvest it into their businesses. And so particularly in places like England, where the English Reformation under Henry VIII. Is a little bit motivated, is a little bit influenced by John Calvin. Calvin is sort of the official theologian that Henry VIII chooses to kind of theologically justify the English Reformation. So in England and then in places like the Netherlands, you basically get people, according to Weber, investing heavily in industry, right? So what Weber says is, okay, if we look at this kind of crude or this kind of Marxist principle of history, right? Everything is economics. Weber's like, and it's only the changes in the means of production that lead to new social forms. Weber's like, not so much, because what I'm seeing here in my account of kind of Northern European capitalist growth is that religion, and specifically the way Calvinists interpreted salvation, ultimately led to a transformation in the economic system, right? And I mean, what Weber's kind of reacting to is that England and the Netherlands and parts of Belgium roared ahead of Catholic countries like France and Italy and Spain in terms of their capitalist development, right? So the kind of Protestant Northern European, and I guess parts of Germany as well, kind of economically were developing as capitalist states much more quickly than France and Italy. And he said that this is a basic difference between a Catholic vision of the world, which values asceticism in a different way than the kind of Reformed vision that views asceticism in this particular way. And asceticism is just living simply. Is that what you're asking? Yeah, like living, basically like without luxury is asceticism. Okay, so that's Weber's basic vision, right? And so he's like, religion can transform the world as much as anything else. Yeah, please.
Conceptually, he argues that Christianity and Calvinism have this weird kind of stress.
Oh, this weird kind of stress on industriousness and kind of reinvesting your kind of wealth to prove that you are on the guesses, right? You're being given prosperity by God, so you get to go to, it's clear that you're already on this list of people predestined to go to heaven. Their businesses, right? Like, so they, according to Weber, right? And this is why capitalism races ahead in Northern Europe, right? Because people are taking all this excess wealth and instead of giving it, say, to the poor or to the church, they invest it in their businesses, and that leads to the crazy growth of capitalism. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. We're good with that? So I'm now going to tell you something else about Weber. This book is a giant pound of nonsense. So I'll tell you, we'll meet my spirit animal in a moment. Rodney Stark, who is my favorite sociologist of religion because he can't get along with anybody. And I, for some reason, just love the curmudgeonly kind of, even when he was young, he was a curmudgeon. And my favorite quote from him is it's in a book, I think, called Why God? And Stark says, the Protestant ethic is a thesis so stupid that only sociologists could still bother to repeat it at this point. So not a great, hey, welcome to sociology. And he's right? The Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism is one of these sociological works that's done by a non-specialist, non-historian, right? Weber, for all of his merits, and he has many, was not a historian, and he gets a lot of things profoundly wrong. Like, he sort of assumes that capitalism and the emergence of capitalism is linked to this Protestant work ethic, right? So the Protestant ethic. And this is a function of historical illiteracy on Weber's part. And I mean, what I'll say about it is, subsequent kind of historians, and if you want a very quick and kind of easy read version of it, you can look at Rodney Stark's book, How the West Won. But basically, capitalism and kind of proto-forms of capitalism go back much further than, the Protestant Reformation, well into, say, the 12th and 13th centuries. Sort of proto-capitalist forms appear first in Catholic monasteries, where the monasteries are extremely productive, but they produce like one thing. So they start, trading that one thing for currency, which they then use to buy all the other things they need, right? Some monks are very good at making cheese. Some monks are very good at making beer and a whole bunch of other commodities, right? And they use their monk time that isn't used in prayer to make stuff. The Italian city-states, particularly Milan, right, is essentially a proto-capitalist state going back probably to about the 1200s. And, in a lot of these Catholic countries and in like the Catholic monasteries, some of the key kind of innovations that make capitalism possible, things like double entry bookkeeping and credit, all emerge, essentially from Italian city-states. And for a long time, well into the 18th century, most of the major banks are Italian. Most of the kind of places that are granting credit to, say, kings and countries and businesses are all Italian banks that set up branches in England, in the Netherlands, and all of these places, right? So capitalism was well on its way to being created well prior to the Protestant Reformation. There's reasons why England and the Netherlands do thrive in particular ways. Won't get into that here. It's a question for a different course, but it's not about the Protestant work ethic. So, well, it's a very interesting piece of kind of historical sociology. It's wrong. It's completely wrong, and it's dreadfully wrong. And the worst thing about it, we've continued to kind of propagate it, and probably if you've taken like classical social theory, maybe someone made you read this book. Historians at the time knew that this was wrong and said so, and yet sociologists have continued to propagate it. Yeah.
That's actually why I was going to ask, why is this still taught? Because in your basics, in your foundational classes, like a class you take before this,
Yeah.
in 200 level, you read this Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism as a piece. I don't know. If it's so wrong, then why is it still carried on?
I think there's a lot of, capital is also wrong, right? So, and it's still taught.
But you're told capital is
right.
largely wrong.
That's true. I think there's probably a sense that where, how to put this generously to my colleagues, sociologists may not always be aware of the critiques of some sociological works, especially kind of classic ones. And frankly, many sociologists are not particularly good or knowledgeable historians, right? Think about Foucault, right? So Foucault, which we will not talk about in this class because I don't want to. I'm traumatized enough by Foucault and trying to explain it to first-year undergrads in SOS 100 in a way that makes sense. Foucault is notorious for misusing history, right? His kind of foundational kind of ideas come from a piece by Nietzsche called On the Uses and Abuses of History. And I think what Foucault took from that was I should abuse history as much as possible. And it gets it foundationally wrong, yet we still use Foucault a lot, right? His history of sexuality is nonsense. It's complete and utter nonsense from a historical perspective. He gets so many things wrong. It's a 3-volume work that was supposed to be 6 volumes. And I can only say, as someone who was forced to read it as part of my PhD, I'm really profoundly glad he died after 3 volumes.
Was he wrong about the origins of capitalism?
Yeah, absolutely, 100% wrong about it.
The rest of it have kind of merit on? Did that exist? Did that effective Calvinist exist? Or was that just bullshit?
I think he thought it was true. Is that? Unlike Foucault, who I think is just making stuff up, I don't think Weber was making stuff up. I think he actually thought he found a pattern. But I think if you look deeply at the history of capitalism and the foundational institutions that, and we shouldn't get hung up on this point too much, the foundational institutions that make capitalism possible, even in England and the Netherlands, they all pre-exist the Protestant Reformation, right? The banking system, double entry bookkeeping, credit that is on paper. Actually, it's hard to stress how important that is like that people aren't trucking big chests of gold all over Europe to lend it to people. That it's like, I'm going to give you a loan from my bank where the money is held in Italy. Here's a piece of paper that says you officially have this much money. You may now spend it, right? Like some of those technologies developed by Italians, some of them by Italian monks, really are foundational to capitalism. And so capitalism is already kind of, whirring in Europe as early as the 1200s, right? Now I would say it's proto-capitalism, and it really bursts forth with the Industrial Revolution. But I think the history that Weber has, it's like, Protestantism gave capitalism its life. It's like, yeah, except if you look at all those Italian city-states that were doing capitalism 2 centuries earlier, right? And so I don't think so. I think the story of capitalism is both far more interesting and far longer than Marxists or kind of Weberian sociologists give it credit. And so, yeah, I mean, and partially this is maybe that Weber's not a specialist. Maybe he doesn't have the evidence that we have today, right? We have a century more or less on this book now in terms of building a much more refined kind of history of capitalism. But it's almost assuredly wrong, right? Well, I say almost assuredly, as that's kind of a qualification. It's wrong. It's just wrong. There's no... Anyway, and I would stress that, to my colleagues when I have the chance, that they should stop teaching this book as though it's true, because it's not, and they really should read critiques of it. And often I think people don't read the critiques. It's like, there's a kind of tradition in even teaching classic social theory. It's like, well, I had to read Weber, so I'm going to put it upon my students. But I don't think it should be taught anymore. Or if it's taught, it should be taught with, a giant shaker of salt, to be honest. Like not just a pinch, but, a whole jar of it. Are we good with my angry critique of Weber, which I make every year? All right, we watched this video last time. We won't watch it again. As much as Fry is a fun guy. Okay. Okay, so amongst other things, though, all right, leaving aside the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, Weber, along with Marx and Durkheim and pretty much everybody else until fairly recently, was a believer in basically a secularization theory, right, that suggested that capitalism and modernity would lead to rationalization of society, right? And so, some of the things that he predicts were, that institutions, so one of the things he predicts is what he calls differentiation, right? So that institutions that are fundamentally tied to religion at Weber's time, healthcare, schools, a lot of government functions, or even the social welfare state, would be differentiated, right? And as modernity kind of moves forward and societies realize that, having the church run everything is not the most rational way of doing things, basically society would rationalize, it would tilt towards, under the sway of capitalism and modernity, towards the idea of efficiency, right? So everything should be super duper efficient. And, we should organize everything with these big bureaucracies that make everything very efficient. And this would ultimately kind of push religion in its social roles to the side, right? So you would then have healthcare, social welfare, and education run by the state, which would be far more efficient at it. And this would lead to essentially disenchantment, right? Where the kind of pre-modern world was a world full of spirits, full of supernatural beings that could do things, modernity would make the world disenchanted, right? It would take all of the enchantment and magic out of the world. Things that were prior explained by the supernatural would come to be explained by science and rationality. And so it would lead to fully materialist explanations, right? You would no longer need supernatural explanations for things. And therefore, as religion became unnecessary, it should disappear. Now, Weber is sort of, unlike Marx, who I think saw this as an unalloyed good, and Durkheim, who I think saw it as a serious social crisis, right? That as you get rid of religion, what's going to come in its place? For Durkheim, it's the cult of the individual. Weber, I think, is a little bit like, it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just the way society is going to evolve under the sway of modernity, right? And so he is, at his core, like Durkheim and like Marx, a secularist. and someone who believes religion is going away. Ah. Sorry. Ah, I hate Freud so much. And yet I feel the need to explain Freud for some reason. Freud is not a sociologist. He clearly comes from another discipline called psychoanalysis, which is sort of like psychology, but where you make shit up. Sorry, my opinion of Freud being what it is. Okay, so what does Freud think? So Freud, very much influenced by a lot of the sort of secularist thought. I think has read a lot of Nietzsche as well. Don't even get me started on Nietzsche. That's a whole course in and of itself. But basically, he thought that religion essentially was a hindrance to society, right? And this quote from Freud, religion is an illusion, and it derives its strength from the fact that it falls in with our instinctual desires, right? He thought it was a reversion to the childish. I think I have the quote on the next one. Religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view, right? So he loved religion, right? Very friendly to it. Okay. So fundamentally, and I think taking this from the same person that Marx took a lot of his thinking, Ludwig Feuerbach, Freud sees religion as fundamentally a form of wish fulfillment, right? It is like, what would we, because we lack a good father in this world, well, we'll invent a good father in heaven. Again, very much a Judeo-Christian kind of lens on Freud. It's wish fulfillment. The kind of deities we create are functions of what we want out of the universe, right? So again, this kind of Marxian notion of, religion doesn't make man, man makes religion. This is entirely, Freud in a nutshell. And he thinks it's childish, right? It's this like, if you ever hear like the snarky atheists on like Reddit or something, and they're like, oh, do you need your sky daddy? Well, that language is very Freud kind of centric, right? It comes from people like Freud, right? And you're a child, you're being childish. Do you need like a special, dad in the sky to help you, this kind of thing. And I'm not being entirely fair to Freud, but I mostly am. And now I'm going to explain to you where Freud thinks religion comes from. And this is why I say Freud is so full of shit. He just makes things up out of thin air with absolutely no evidence. And it drives me completely bonkers. And it's everything with Freud. It's just freaking everything. I just can't take him. Like the Oedipus complex, where does he come up with this? I don't know. No one does, because he just makes it up. All right, in this book, Totem and Taboo, Freud comes up with his imagined scenario for how religion emerged. And guess what? It's all because of daddy issues. Shock. So, in this Freudian vision, somewhere back in prehistory, right, when humans were tribal creatures, there was a king, right, or a warrior lord of a tribe. And as part of being king, he was the one that got to have sex with all the women, right? So all of the women in the tribe were having sex with the king, and basically he would never allow anyone else to have sex with any of the other women. Okay, this is literally what it says. I'm not making this up. It's so stupid. So what happens is eventually he has a bunch of sons, and those sons want to have sex with women too. So they get jealous of their father and kill him, right? So that they have access to women as well. But then they feel bad that they killed their dad, right? And because they can't, emulate, now there's lots of these sons, they all want access to women, so they can't emulate their dad, and have all the women. So basically they fight with each other, and it creates a big conflict. And religion arises to manage the frustration of this arrangement and the guilt that comes from having committed fratricide. And so God emerges as a projection of their unconscious minds that tells them what they did was bad and that they can be forgiven and all of these sorts of things. And I wish this was a caricature that I'm lying out of what Freud thinks, but it's actually not. This is entirely, how he thinks religion emerged. And why it frustrates me so much, and I'm not being very nice to Herr Sigmund, is because he presents no evidence that this is the case. This is entirely an imagined scenario, right? So his idea that God is a projection of the unconscious mind to deal with the guilt of some primordial patricide is entirely just made up, right? It has no basis in anything. It's just, Freud is a kook, to put it kindly. And sorry, I don't know if I've told this story before. I know I've told it in other classes. One year, one of the grad students said we should start a Freud reading group to read Freud and really absorb Freud. And I went to the first meeting wherein I told them, you should all stop reading Freud because he's a kook, and then left. Because I'm like, no, we should not be reading Freud. Let's stop. Freud has nothing to tell us. Please, aside from like a historical curiosity, Freud has no insight at all. Anyway, I like the questions. Okay. I think it was an interesting question. Like, don't worry, we'll get through everything we need to before the first midterm. We'll be fine. Okay. Another kind of classical sociologist, right? Another one you've probably been hearing about since first year is this guy named Talcott Parsons, right? So he's one of these American cats who goes off to Europe to study, picks up a bunch of Durkheim and Durkheimian kind of functionalist thought in Europe, and, basically kind of comes back to America with this very functionalist kind of thinking. So what does Parsons say, about religion? Well, being a functionalist, right, he thinks that religion is part of these, and Parsons is interesting in taking Durkheim in a different direction, right, that society is composed of all of these social structures and institutions that all have vital but limited functions in maintaining social order. Right, so he sees religion as kind of one of these, right? And this is a very classic, this diagram is a very kind of classic Talcott Parsons kind of like, where does everything go, right? So the family's at the center of society, right? Because it's sort of the basic unit. And then all these other institutions kind of orbit around family in terms of providing different things to, society. So religion specifically for Parsons, right, provides a set of values which form the basis of a kind of social consensus about what is right and wrong, how you should act in society, right? So other institutions then kind of reinforce those things, right? So there's kind of a mutually reinforcing thing between family and religion, right? Education will take a lot of those social values and kind of, reinforce them once again, right? So it socializes children, but has a lot of the values from religion as well. And all of these kind of work together, right? So basically, religion, though, is just about providing the moral consensus for a society. And therefore, that's basically all it really needs to do. So things like, the kind of basic laws of religion, the 10 Commandments or such things, for Parsons, form the kind of basis of laws, right? The basis of moral values, which then get expanded by the state or the polity, right? Which is, the kind of political system. So they give the kind of values and then they get turned into laws by the polity. Okay, does that all make sense? Okay, Parsons is pretty easy to understand. The other thing for Parsons that religion does is it provides sort of psychological protection from things, right? From unexpected events in life, right? It can, so sudden death, sudden illness, right? The illness of a loved one, your own illness, premature death, right? Which in previous times was very, very common, right? People died very young. Mothers especially had a tendency to die for obvious reasons. Sudden illness and premature death were kind of things that religion basically helped make sense of, right? Religion, helps make sense of events and restore kind of normal order, right? It tells you what to do, right? So when someone dies, for 7 days, you sit Shiva if you're Jewish, right? And you go through the mourning process. a lot of religious systems have prescribed times of mourning, right? Whether it's 7 days or a year, right? Yeah, please.
Curiosity, is this care management theory or like
It's
kind of sound?
it's a little different. Like, I think you could fit terror management into what Parsons is describing. Though I think he's more thinking about the role that it plays for individuals. It's like it gives a sense of meaning, and it helps. Like, okay, so always think about functionalists, right? It's like things get out of balance, and that can threaten society. And religion, in its kind of ability to make sense of the world, can help put things back in balance, right? So it's like, okay, a war came, and many of our people died, but religion will give you a sense of what that meant, and then that can reestablish the kind of balance in society so that other things don't get completely messed up, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. It's all about, social equilibrium is all what the functionalists care about, right? And religion is part of that, and it can restore social equilibrium by adding meaning to it, right? So it can explain disastrous outcomes like crop failures or depressions or things like that. So, basically maintaining social stability, relieving tensions and frustrations that arise following catastrophe for Parsons are what religion does. Okay, good. Oh, wait, yes. No, basically, he's a functionalist, right? So he thinks all of these kind of emerge naturally, but he thinks family is at the core of society, right? Because without family, society disappears, right? Because there's no people. So all the other institutions kind of orbit around family and support family, but it's not that family created them, right? And they're not, they all kind of emerge naturally, right? Government doesn't emerge from family either. It just emerges naturally from society, right? Okay. Oh, yes.
Is he a secularist, or does he believe that religion will continue?
I think I'm trying to think. Parsons, there's an aspect of Parsons, he'll talk about things like religious evolution, right? Where I think he believes that religion is going to eventually. Do I have this on I have this on another slide with him? No. I can't remember. I have it somewhere, but I can't remember which slide it is. At his core, I think he thinks that religion is going to continue to evolve, and it'll serve some purpose, and it may become individualized, right? Later on we'll meet Thomas Luckman, and I think there's a kind of meeting of minds between Parsons and Luckman, right? Where it's like eventually this will all become more and more individualized, and religion is part of society, but it's going to evolve so it won't stay in the form that it is. So even like secularization, I think Parsons will see as kind of more religious evolution than anything else. Though I don't think he thinks it's going to disappear entirely like a lot of the others. Good. Okay. Does that answer your question, Matt? Okay. What am I? Oh, yeah. Okay. I think I said this already. Contradictory experience. Okay. Religion helps, figure out things like why, contradictory experiences. Why people profiting through unjust behavior, things like why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, right? There'll be a reward or punishment in the hereafter, right? Hell is a useful kind of modifier in the sense that it's like, who's a terrible person? Jeff Bezos, we'll say, as a terrible person, maybe. I don't know. Maybe he's great. I have no idea. And he's wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice. But when he gets to the pearly gates, he'll be reminded that it's easier for a rich man or a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven, and the trap door opens and something like that, right? It helps make sense of contradictory experiences. I had my Bugs Bunny version of the entry into heaven. Okay, so Robert Bella. Okay, so this is I've been talking about Bella all throughout the course, right? And I think you'll recognize it. Religion serves a social function, right? So again, Bella is kind of a functionalist. It evolves over time, right? So it's going to take on new shapes. And Bella, was convinced, and I've talked about American civil religion, right? That civil religion was replacing actual religion, like in the kind of modern era, right? So traditional religion was declining. And in some ways, right, I've had a few questions in the course, like, what about these forms of like American Christianity that sort of blend nationalism and Christianity in weird ways? I think for Bella, right, this is civil religion sort of taking over and the like Republican politics merging with Christianity. Yeah, please.
Would Scientology fall into this definition, or is that a bit different?
I think Scientology is more properly classed as a new religious movement.
Because it's not about like, oh, we're sane, rational people that make our own decisions, which to classify that as a religion.
But also, we're the ghosts, we're spirits of aliens that were cast down by Xanu, and now exist in a plane of suffering because we're stuck in these human bodies, and you have to go through the different tiers to free your consciousness and return to the mothership. I can't even remember. That's how fucking crazy Scientology is. Like South Park did a really good explanation. I should go find it, and it's actually like 100% accurate. But yeah, it's like there was a cosmic war, and a bunch of alien spirits were, left bodiless, and they found human bodies on Earth, and something Xanu something. Anyway, I'm sorry if you're a Scientologist. I just said your religion is crazy, but it is. Lawsuit incoming. They're very litigious too. Anyway, but yeah, Scientology I think is more properly classed as a new religious movement, like culty kind of vibes. There's a really good indication that it's one of these new religious movements that's well on its way to extinction. It peaked and then it's kind of fallen off. Yeah, please.
Would you maybe argue that civil religions are more prone to cult-like? Like, I know the line between cult and religion is kind of a messy one, but like, are they more skewed towards cultish behavior than religious to a certain point, where it's like you're worshiping physical people who like tell you?
But and I mean, sometimes I would be cautious about that kind of statement because sometimes you're not, right? Like sometimes you're worshiping something as, worldly, but nebulous as the nation, right? And sometimes it does get into, in the case of, say, Nazism, which definitely had the kind of religious feels that Bella kind of envisions in civil religion. Yeah, you're worshiping the Fuhrer. But then, like, American civil religion is kind of odd. I guess it's like Jefferson and Washington, non-living people. Very rarely do living presidents get that same kind of respect. The last two before Biden maybe being weird exceptions. But then again, never kind of fully, right? It's never like a full reverence of them in the way that a deity would get, right? Both Obama and Trump had somewhat over-excitable followings, I think. Anyway, traditional religion, but without reference to God. Yeah, go ahead.
So is civil religion like nationalism, or is it like a criminal code and obeying law, there's no God?
It's more like almost elevating the nation to the level of the sacred, right? Think about it that way. Like, there's something, you hear this sometimes, was it Ronald Reagan? Oh, I can't remember which president it was, that took this metaphor out of the Bible and compared America to the shining city on the hill, right? Was it Reagan? Okay, I thought it was Reagan. That sounds like Ronald Reagan, which is a straight out biblical metaphor, right? Like this is like New Jerusalem that comes down from heaven, and he's comparing America to this. So you're kind of giving like the divine or quasi-divine kind of impetus to the nation state. And think about it, like in the U.S., how they treat, the founding fathers, right, and the Constitution as quasi-sacred documents, right? It's like a lot of debates in America are like, well, what did the founding fathers intend? And it's like, who cares? They're dead. Like, and they were writing in the 1700s, so maybe they didn't have insight into the modern world. But there's this like reverence for the thought of these people and things like the Constitution, right? We can never violate the Constitution, and changing it requires, this incredibly arcane process because it sort of has this, quasi-sacred kind of dimension. Yeah. There could be aspects of it. I think, given the relative newness of Canada and the fact that, let's say, Canada's constitution's only, is about the same age as I am, that does tend to undermine it. But like England, right, the role of the Queen and the kind of sacred, the merging of kind of state and religion in a figure like the royalty. I guess the Queen is dead. I should say the King now. I just don't want to acknowledge Big Ears as my king. Sorry, go ahead.
Kind of bouncing off that, could you argue, because like with our part of Race and Freedom, they like update it constantly, like you're taking things and moving things around and stuff and removing things. Is that kind of like almost a shield of protection from a civil religion? Because it's like, how can you worship a document that gets changed 20 times a year, that is always under debate, that we're constantly scrutinizing?
Yeah, well, I think the important thing is, for Bella, it's not all countries are going to develop like a civil religion. It's only some of them, right? And the U.S., I mean, you can think of, even, let's say, we won't take a contemporary example, like the Soviet Union, right? And the way it quasi-deified, trust me, I've been to Russia. There's statues of Lenin and Marx all over the freaking place, like it's a religion, right? Churches were turned into temples of reason and museums of communism, right? Specifically for these particular reasons of kind of deifying, in a sense, the Soviet state. So a lot of the things that the Orthodox Church used to do, those traditions were transposed into kind of civil ceremonies that the Soviet state performed, right? And so there can be this thing where like the state and a particular set of ideologies around it will be elevated. It's not every single state, right? And obviously, like, I would suspect that the Dutch probably don't have as much of a civil religion. It's just not, it's only certain nations that have a particular sense of their own meaning, right? But it does kind of come at times. Although the EU might have a certain civil religion kind of aspects, but hopefully that makes sense. Okay, did I talk about everything on this slide? Yeah, any system that doesn't rely on God or gods, but still inspires a passionate mass response, a high degree of commitment, right? So yeah, like American nationalism in its worst and best forms, Nazism, Soviet communism, even Russian nationalism. Yeah, man.
You have a civil religion and a theocracy.
That's an interesting question. I had never considered whether that is possible. I think of like Iran, and yeah, probably in that the Iranian state is given this sort of quasi-divine mission within Islam, right, by the Ayatollahs. So I would say yes, but it's going to be this weird blend of like state and religion in a peculiaristic way. How many slides did I get through today? Because I'm like, Scientology is a multi-level marketing scheme. I don't know, man. Like, maybe. So Freud just made up the story of the tribe. Yes, Freud just makes stuff up. But was judging people for making up religion. Yes, that is Freud. I hate him. Okay. How much? Oh, yeah, we have too much time to quit early. All right. And 10 slides. So we're doing okay. We're going to spend a lot of time. This probably will take up the bulk of Friday on Peter Berger. Try to go a little faster. Berger's a really influential figure, right? Probably one of the most influential sociologists in general of the 20th century. Professor at BU. He has this whole bunch of work on, the social construction of reality. So he's a constructionist and a really important one. We'll talk about all that in a sec. And when it comes to sociology of religion, he's very famous for authoring a book, being the author of the Sacred Canopy theory in a book called The Sacred Canopy. Okay, so what does social construction of reality kind of entail? It's this sort of, I would say, dialectic way of looking at how society constructs individual subjects and how those subjects then influence society in return, right? So for Berger, right, I think in a lot of ways being a little bit on the functionalist side at times, society is a product of humans. I guess social constructivist. Let's just leave them there. Society is produced by humans, right? We made societies. We made different societies. Different societies have emerged out of different environmental conditions at different moments. And society is entirely a product of the people within it, right? We create the institutions. We create, the structures. We set up how the society is from top to bottom. So society is a product of humans, but humans themselves are also products of those societies, right? So, you are shaped by the society you were born into. Um, I was talking about this with my daughter as I drove her to school today. She was saying, I would never have been a Nazi. And I'm like, because we invited a Nazi to Parliament, having a conversation. Anyway. And I'm like, no, one of the things that's probably universally true is if you had lived in Germany in the 1930s, there's an off chance you would have been a Nazi. Unfortunately true, most people go along with the social consensus because we're shaped by the society we live in. The biases of that society are our biases. The hatreds of that society are our hatreds, right? We are shaped, and as much as we want to think like, I would never have done that, you would have. I would never have been a communist in the Soviet Union. Yeah, well, except you probably would have been, because you wouldn't have known any different, right? So, society is produced by humans, and humans produce society. But then, there's this other kind of step for Burger that you're never sort of trapped in it, because it's this ongoing process, right? New generations of human reshape those institutions and beliefs in particular ways. Otherwise, you could never have social change, right? So it shapes human experience, but it's also shaped constantly by new generations of people. So society is shaped in this kind of ongoing process. Okay, so for Burger, and you can see the kind of language that I'm using here to describe what he says, and I think you'll recognize, that this is Durkheimian, is a Weberian, and it's Marxian in its kind of tones, right? It shares a lot with those previous schools of sociology. The world is of our own making, right? The social world especially, and this includes religion, right? Religions they emerge from societies, which is why we have such a diversity of them for Burger, right? Because each society is going to produce a religion that sort of fits with its place and time in history. So, religions emerge from different social contexts, but we're also shaped by those. So we shape those religions. We're also shaped by them, right? Religion helps human beings make sense of the world, right? And it gives a sort of order to our thinking, and our understanding of the world is formed by those religions, right? Now, for Burger, generally religion is sort of, for most people, he thinks, a secondary kind of concern, right? Most people, and historically especially, are focused in the here and now, right? You're less focused on heaven and what happens after you die, unless you're one of these religious specialists, than how am I going to pass my classes? Why is Professor Broussard rattling on? Would he stop answering all these irrelevant questions so we can just move on and get through this? I'm worried about the midterm. You're not so worried like, I don't know, like, is the world coming to an end in 2025 according to the Mayan calendar or whatever, right? You're not so concerned about this. But for Burger, and I'll end with this, my clock says I'm out of time. The ordinary gets ruptured. We'll pick up with the ordinary being ruptured on Wednesday. Oh, sorry, it is Wednesday, Friday. And we made it through 12 slides. So we're increasing our pace by 2 slides a class. If we keep up this pace, we're going to get through it. All right, we'll see you on Friday. Howdy.
Is this the last topic for the midterm, like the slideshow?
This will be, I think we're not going to get through secularization, which matches exactly what I did last year, so it turns out perfect, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So will Wednesday be the cutoff, or will it be like Monday? Like in terms of material we need to know first.
We'll see how far we get, right? And there might be a little bit left to cover on Wednesday before we do Q&A and I show you some practice questions, right?
Sounds good.
All right, cheers. Hello.
Example questions for what to expect on
Absolutely. I'm going to go through all of that with you. Yeah.
And the midterm and like the way it is, because it's all like 5 short answers.
Yeah.
How would that tie into like the lecture topics? Because usually like when you have a test with like multiple choice, it's kind of like, okay, like you have your options and you have the question and you answer it.
So basically the way it's set up is like each kind of topic that we covered, you'll have like, so I think we've covered basically, hang on, let me look. I'm going to tell you exactly how it's set up without showing you the questions. I just have to go into my e-class here.
Another question would be a lot of the theories that we learn, and I've done a lot of social theory,
Yeah.
and so it's always like, this is what the theory is, but it's incorrect and it's not right and it doesn't apply.
It'll be more like explain it through its own lens, right?
So yeah, that's what I was like, so